This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed. G'day, I'm Kate Watson. This week our guest is Bryce Corbett, my colleague, friend and a journalist with an expansive career having worked for many of our major media outlets. More recently though, he's the director of Squiz Kids, having started our daily news podcast for busy families back in 2020. That podcast is now listened to by thousands of families around the brekkie table, on the drive to school, and by even more kids and their teachers in primary classrooms around Australia. The enthusiasm shown by those classrooms led us to create a digital literacy program called Newshounds. No doubt, many of you will have heard us talk about it. Bryce has just returned from a trip, thanks to being awarded a Churchill Fellowship around the world to learn more about the problems of mis- and disinformation and how others are tackling it. In this conversation, we'll talk through some of what he found. And there's another reason Bryce might interest you. He was one of the only journalists to interview Belle Gibson, the health and wellness influencer back in 2015, where she confessed her cancer diagnosis was false. It's one of the most sensational and early stories of social media being used to influence masses of people based on a lie. Bryce, you've just returned from a worldwide mis- and disinformation adventure to the US, the UK, Finland, Estonia and France. You've given me access to your notes from that trip. You write that in your introduction to a series you're going to make off the back of this, that ensuring an informed citizenry, one that is digitally literate and can tell online facts from fiction, will become one of the defining challenges of the next decade. Just explain that.
All right, so the Churchill Fellowship was the trip that you're referring to that I was awarded last year and undertook at the beginning of this year. So if the Churchill Fellowship, by way of explanation, the Winston Churchill Trust Australia hands out fellowships every year to people to travel overseas to study how their area of interest is being practiced in other countries around the world. So media literacy, obviously, is the area of interest that I was looking into. And the countries that I visited and the ones you mentioned in the introduction are countries who I think probably are at the vanguard of understanding that if you don't have an informed citizenry and one who is able to tell online fact from fiction, then your democracy is at enormous risk of crumbling. And that was writ large in some of the countries that I visited, particularly those close to Russia for various reasons, which I'm sure we will go into.
You started in the US. The first person you met was Professor Weinberg. He has written a book. It's called Verified: How to Think Straight, Get Duped Less and Make Better Decisions About What to Believe Online.
Yeah.
One of the things you explore with him is what the internet has done for information gathering for all of us, I guess, and that change that we've seen.
Yeah, and one of the things that I took away from that conversation was the idea that, you know, when we were growing up, we were taught at school how to find information. We were taught how to decipher the Dewey Decimal System if ever we had to go into a library. That's right, to find information for a project or something, or perhaps how to get our hands on a series of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Finding information was very much the lesson that we were taught back then. These days, it's not a question of needing to teach kids how to find information, but rather how to filter it, because they have so much information coming at them. So the real skill that should be being taught now is how to filter that information and work out what's real and what is not.
I even remember I was probably just at the cusp of when computers started to come into your library and at school, and you had to learn how to search and use search engines properly. And it was still this idea, even with the internet in those early days, it was still this teaching you how to find things. I've heard you say that anecdote, that how much it's changed. Now it is about, like, anyone can find anything.
Yes.
It's just about determining whether it's the right thing to find.
And I would even submit that probably back in the early days of the internet, that you could probably search for things on there and trust that what you were going to find find was going to be reliable information. But that has shifted so dramatically in the last 30 years, such that you really have to sort through a whole lot of rubbish before you actually find anything, any information that's of any value. And you have to be super, super careful about. And this is only being turbocharged, obviously, with the advent of artificial intelligence, because by its very nature, artificial intelligence is a machine learning process. So the machine is running through the internet to gather information, and if a lot of the information that is using as a source material is rubbish, then eventually the quality of that information pushed out by artificial intelligence is also going to be tainted.
So what you discovered, obviously, California was where you landed first. This was all in San Francisco, is that there are governments around the world looking at making education around this mandatory. California is one of those places, but perhaps more of a token at this point than actually something that's being implemented very well.
I had read a lot about how the Californian legislators had introduced mandatory media literacy education for kids at school from kindergarten right through to the end of primary school. And I thought, wow, how wonderfully advanced and how wonderfully Californian of them to be so advanced in their thinking on this. I mean, as it transpired, and the more people I spoke to, it seemed as if whilst the legislation does exist, there's very little in the way of it being put into practice, or there's very little in the way of the detail around how that should be put into practice in classrooms. So it is something it's a little bit toothless, the legislation there, according to the people that I spoke with. But even so, this understanding that making sure that our populations are inoculated against mis and disinformation is for the national good. It's for the good of the democracies in which all of these people live, because, as I've said, and I will say until I'm blue in the face, if you don't have an informed citizenry, then your chances of safeguarding the democracy you live in are severely lessened.
When I think about this, and we're actually having this conversation the week after the Edelman Trust barometers come out. We're going to talk about that quite a lot. Obviously, you'll hear about that in the news quite a bit. A lot of it seems to come down to trust, like this moment we're in where there is such distrust in our institutions, in our government, in our media, NGOs, business. That, for example, that barometer found that 68% of Australians believe journalists purposely mislead people, and that media was considered the most incompetent and unethical institution. How much of this blame lays with our institutions, and if we're trying to turn it around, how much are people going to actually pay any attention?
Well, it's hard, isn't it? Because, hindsight's a wonderful thing. And I was working in a newspaper newsroom at the advent of the internet, because I am that old. And at the time, I don't think we really had any idea of what was coming, the massive shift change that was coming down the road. And I would always submit that, when you work in a newsroom, you're so focused on tomorrow's deadline, or increasingly with the advent of 24-hour news and the internet, they're so focused on feeding the beast, essentially, just keep feeding content into their platforms. It doesn't lend itself to a lot of long-term strategic thinking. It's not something that journalists are renowned for, because they really are just so focused on getting out tomorrow's newspaper or tonight's bulletin or whatever it may be. And I think that has ill-served the news industry generally. But then I think so much of the waters have been muddied. You only have to look at, the way in which children, and I look to my own children, are consuming news and information, and that is so drastically different to the way that we did growing up. There were a handful of sources of news and information that we could look to if we wanted to know what was going on in the world. They were the television news, they were newspapers, they were radio bulletins. And you took for granted that the information that you were getting was reliable. These days, I don't know any kids who watch free-to-air television. Certainly my own two don't. They're all watching YouTube. If they're getting any news and information at all, it's off whatever TikTok feeds they're on or Instagram feeds that they happen to be on. And so there has been an explosion in the number of sources from which they are getting news and information, but the reliability of that information has become incredibly diluted.
Which brings me to the fact that you were there when Meta announced they were going to remove fact-checking from their platforms.
I know.
How did that go down?
Wow. I mean,
in the moment. Where were you in Washington? Or?
I was in San Francisco that morning, and it was all over the news. And it was, and I had a meeting that morning with one of San Francisco's main public broadcasters, because the US has a very rich and vibrant public broadcasting network, PBS and NPR between them, and they're very well respected. They're like the ABCs, I guess, of the US. And I was meeting with one of those outfits whilst I was in San Francisco that particular morning, and they were in shock. But, you know, they were all very much on tenterhooks anyway because the election had taken place, and they knew that there was a Trump administration coming in, and they had learned from bitter experience from the last Trump administration that it didn't look too kindly on organisations that existed to try to counter mis and disinformation. To a large extent, that was the stock in trade of the Trump administration. I mean, this is a man who created arguably the expression fake news and weaponized it. So there was an enormous amount of trepidation on their part, not just around the implications from Facebook announcing that it would no longer have fact-checking on its platform, but also and more significantly around what the incoming Trump administration was going to mean for the funding that they all relied upon to do the work that they were doing.
So the fake news conversation is interesting because people who work in it and who study it, they all agree that trusted news sources are the ones that we've always trusted broadly.
Yeah.
But in fact, there are millions of people voting for Donald Trump, and there are millions of people who consider what he says about fake news to be the case, that that is fake news. So that point around everything's muddied now, it's so confusing to know where to land on this stuff. And, and I'm sure you can appreciate that.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if Trump and his acolytes had any success in the first administration, it was understanding that it didn't actually matter if what you said was true or not, as long as you were creating enough confusion in the minds of the consumer and the minds of the voters, then that was a means to the end that they were all striving. Because if you created confusion and you threw enough chump in the water that everything just got messy, then people would either disengage or they were just more likely to listen to what it was that you were saying anyway, because that was just easier. And that's terrifying. Absolutely terrifying, because that speaks to it's not like any of this is happening by accident, you know, and this is what really scares me and what I found traveling around the world meeting with other people. It's like the sinister motivations behind a lot of the disinformation to which we are increasingly exposed. It is the sort of stuff that can erode the very foundations of the democracies that we take for granted.
So then you leave the US and you head to places like Finland and Estonia. It is absolutely not true there that there's distrust in media and news.
No, quite the contrary. I mean, Finland's amazing. It's a country of 5 billion people. They have something like 300 newspapers. All of them are doing very well and are well respected. And I went to Finland and I went to Estonia, and the meetings that I had there were just sobering, in as much as I was meeting with government officials. And when I was in Estonia, I was meeting with people, you know, from the defense ministry, because media literacy is considered something that's of national importance. So, you know, this is a country that in its history has been passed backwards and forwards between Russia and being an independent country, and then being invaded again by Russia, and then being taken over by Germany. They don't take their independence for granted at all. And they're reminded on a daily basis of how easily it can be taken away from them. And so they consider ensuring that they have a digitally literate population as a matter of national importance, such that it is media literacy and the teaching of media literacy to the entire population sits under the Ministry of Defence, sits across the Ministry of Communications. And I met with government officials there and who explained to me that this is not just a nice to have, this is existential. And they talked about it as information warfare, how they need to prepare their populations to be constantly on alert for information warfare because it comes at them on a daily basis from just across the border. You know, they share a border with Russia and they have the looming threat of this massive, massive country sitting on their doorstep and threatening to erode the fledgling democratic institutions that they've created. And so to suddenly be in countries where media literacy and war footing was spoken of in the same sentence was shocking, illuminating, probably for someone like me quite refreshing because suddenly I was in countries who got it, who were just kind of like, and they've been doing this for, 15, 20 years.
And on Estonia, you write that it's sort of a cradle to grave proposition. Like this isn't just for kids.
No, not at all.
This isn't just for teenagers. This isn't just for young adults or even for the elderly population.
Not
this
at
is
all.
for everybody.
There in Estonia, it's like the Mothers Disinformation League. I've got that name wrong, but it is a group of 50-something women, and it is like a defense league. Do you remember the television show Dad's Army?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
It's like Dad's Army, but for disinformation. And it's like it is a group of senior women in Estonia, and they have clubs just like we have the Country Women's Association here in Australia, and they get together and they hold workshops and they hold seminars and webinars, and it's all about making sure that elderly part of the Estonian population is attuned to the fact that a lot of what they're going to be coming across, a lot of what they're going to be reading on their Facebook or whatever is the version of social media that's very popular in Estonia amongst their senior population is going to be rubbish, and they need to start filtering it and they need to be careful about what they believe.
What is the threat? You talk a little bit in this series you're going to produce about bot farms.
Yeah.
I don't think many people would actually understand what they are.
That's, it is, imagine, an otherwise nondescript looking office space filled with people sitting at computers and creating memes, writing algorithms, creating pieces of mis and disinformation whose very and often these are government sponsored, whose very goal is to cause confusion, cause chaos. We saw it at the Paris Olympics, for example. You probably remember the bed bug story that travelled around the world. Well, there's a lot of evidence to suggest now that was the creation of a Russian bot farm. There were never any bed bugs, or certainly not to the extent that the world was convinced there were. There were other stories that ran during the time of the Paris Olympics that were created just to hurt the reputation of France, but also to create confusion around this big world event. And all of this stuff is quite often state-sponsored disinformation out of Russia.
And just to make it really, really clear for people, when it comes to a place like Russia, what is the end goal for them? Like, it is this destabilization
of democracy.
Democracies,
is to destabilize the Western democracies whom, they've got this big NATO alliance, and anything that they can do to destabilize those democracies. I mean, if you look at, what is the end goal? We'll look at Russia and Ukraine war. The end goal is continued expansion of Putin's empire. And they have very sophisticated state-sponsored Russian bot farms just churning this stuff out.
Let's talk now about Belle Gibson. If anyone out there has watched the documentary on Netflix about her tale, it's called, I think, Instagram's Worst Con Artist.
Correct.
You feature in it quite
Yes.
heavily as one of the journalists at the Australian Women's Weekly who interviewed her when she confessed it was all a lie. Tell me how that story came to you.
That story came to us. So the editor of the Women's Weekly at the time, a great colleague and friend of mine, Helen McCabe, was at a function in Melbourne, and it was at the height of the Belle story. So at that point, she had Richard Gilliatt at the Australian had broken the story that she was starting to have doubts around whether or not her cancer diagnosis was in fact correct, and she was starting. There was a bit of a wobble, and at the same time, the boys at The Age, Bo Donnelly and Nick Toscano, the journos at The Age, they had published a report saying that the charities to which she had claimed to have sent money had never seen any of that money. So it was all starting to unravel. And I think Belle at that point understood that she needed to do something about that and sought the counsel of a crisis comms agency in Melbourne. And that guy happened to be at a function that Helen was at in Melbourne. And because they normally worked in corporate comms and worked with, companies and CEOs, he didn't really know what to do with this person who had come to him and said to Helen, I've got this story and I'm just thinking, what do you think? And Helen's like, well, as it happens, I happen to edit
The Woman's Weekly.
The Woman's Weekly.
Yeah.
So she came back from that trip. She said, I think we've got the Belle Gibson interview. And at this point, Belle had decided she wanted to sit down, and I guess it was the confessional. This was the sit down interview where she was going to confess that she didn't in fact have brain cancer. And so we were only days away from deadline at that point. So I dispatched one of our crack journos, Claire Weaver, to Melbourne to meet with Belle, and Claire went down to Melbourne and interviewed her, and I think, as I say in the documentary, like she came back from Melbourne just more confused than when she'd been down. It was like trying to get the truth out of Belle was like trying to nail jelly to a wall, because it just kept moving. Like the stories just kept shifting. Anytime you tried to pin her down on any particular detail, like what was your date of birth, or where were you born, or what is your actual name, or how old are you? Like it all kept moving and shifting and changing, and she was very careful to try to throw, in lots of respects, throw that chump in the water. She figured if she could make it confusing enough, then she never had to account for herself in any proper kind of way. And so I was just like, all right, you need to go back, because clearly you're more confused than the first time we went down. So she sent her back down to Melbourne, and she spent another 2 hours interviewing Belle. And we eventually published the first story, and the first time in which Belle admitted that, yes, she had lied about having brain cancer.
In that piece, you talk a fair bit about why she lied, and but also I think, and the bit that might have been missed in some of the telling of this over the last month or so, seeing as it's sort of re-emerged with this documentary, but also the series Apple Cider Vinegar, is sort of the ingredients that make Belle who she is, and how she was able to convince people of such a big lie.
Yeah. Look, I mean, we spent enough time in Belle's presence, but then subsequent to the story being published, her mother got in contact with the Women's Weekly, and I'll never forget that phone call. It went for about 45 minutes, and it was just the maddest, craziest phone call I think I'd taken as a journalist to date. We flew her parents up to Sydney to interview them. Well, I say her parents, her mother and her stepfather. There were things that became obvious to us in that 48-hour period with her mother, and in the interviewing process, particularly with her mother, they gave us a sense that she'd had, I think, what you might describe as a pretty troubled childhood, which, whilst I would never seek to say that excused her behaviour, it certainly went a long way to explaining it.
You've said to me that you had you were marginally actually empathetic, because I mean at this point the whole world, bit of exaggeration, but the nation and anyone who'd engaged with her and her story really hated her.
And she had gone very quickly from being this amazing wellness warrior and an inspiration to thousands to probably the most hated woman in Australia.
And why?
Why did she do it? Look, I've always believed that that she probably suffered from a condition called Munchausen's. This is where you get an enormous sense of validation from the sympathy that you get by pretending to have an illness. It's an attention-seeking but a validation kind of thing. And you look at the patterns of her behaviour growing up, and she had spent time with a community in Perth who were like skaters, and she had become the full skater, and she had assumed all of the clothes and the hair and the thing. And she had found that, and this was at the very beginnings of the ages of online chats, chat forums, and the very beginning of Instagram, not insignificantly. And she had found that she could get validation from these people, and she found that she would be able to engender sympathy from them by pretending that she was ill. It didn't take long for people to see through it, in that way that compulsive liars, and I think we all know one, eventually you believe them initially because you've got no reason not to, and then after a while you start to go, oh, I don't know, none of this is stacking up, and I feel like, and the lies have to get bigger to sustain the sympathy that they require or to sustain the attention that they crave, until the lies are so big that everybody just pushes you to one side and just doesn't believe you anymore. And then she would move on, which is what she did.
The other thing you point out, though, in the piece, which I find particularly interesting, and we're going to draw the line between this and I guess the conversation we had earlier about your trip and mis and disinformation, is that she isn't the only one culpable for her lie.
No.
There was publishers who published her story. Yeah. There was big business. Like, I didn't realise that Apple had sort of approached her about hosting her app on their platforms.
So her app, which it has to be said was a really good app.
Yeah.
It was beautiful. The recipes looked lovely. They all worked.
Yeah.
And probably if you're a nutritionist, you would look at them and go, well, yeah, you eat according to that app and you probably will feel better. Apple were taken in, and they thought the app was great, and they loved this story of this girl who had brain cancer that was curing it by drinking green juice, and so they stuck her app as one of the default apps that comes when you buy an Apple Watch, which is no small thing. And then, of course, there was Penguin Random House, the massive international publishing house that gave her a book deal, and both of these enormous companies, these enormous corporations, and it boggles the mind now when you think about it, neither of them at any point stopped to ask, well, hang on a minute, is this cancer story true? And have you got any evidence to back it up? Because she didn't. When push came to shove, she had zero actual medical records to suggest that anything she'd been saying about the brain cancer was true.
And I guess I'll give you a free kick here to say that there was journalists that uncovered that, in fact, it was all a lie. And this is where journalism serves its true purpose.
Yeah. And the work that was done by Richard Gilliard at The Australian to uncover it. And he had spent, 12 months researching, and significantly he had gone into that space because his own wife had breast cancer. And as she did, as many women do, you go to the internet and start looking for solutions, medical or otherwise, and that's when he became aware of the number of charlatans who were out there, the snake oil salespeople who were skulking around on the internet. And he eventually stumbled upon Belle and started investigating.
You actually said you did an interview on this for Squiz Shortcuts, and you said she is the con artist and the snake oil salesman
for our time.
Yeah. Enabled by social media, anyone can pretty much say anything without it needing to bear any relation to the truth. That's your quote.
Yeah.
In the context of mis and disinformation and the conversation we've just had, is there just hundreds of thousands of Belle Gibsons now?
Yes, everywhere. I mean, absolutely everywhere. I mean, in the context of, Newshounds, which is the media literacy program we do for primary school kids, we have a module in there on influencers, and it's about teaching kids that teenage or preteen who has got hundreds and thousands of followers is telling you to put lemon juice on your face because it's good for clearing up pimples, does not know what she's talking about. She's not a medical professional, but they are everywhere, absolutely everywhere, because anybody, as I say, can say whatever they want online. And there is nobody policing it, and there is nobody regulating it, and it's a complete free-for-all.
Which brings me to the work you've referred to, Newshounds, that you're doing now. We can only do our bit for this problem? I mean, we've talked everything from information warfare through to, getting bad advice on the internet. Like they're kind of the plethora of issues is actually quite startling. Yeah. Our approach to it is education. So talk to our audience again. I mean, we've talked to our audience a lot about newshounds, but let's hear it from you again.
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously this is a hot topic right now. And last year we saw the Australian government with support of the opposition to introduce and legislate a ban on social media for under 16s in Australia, which is a very noble thing. I don't think anybody, certainly within government or anybody in the wider community, understands how that is going to be implemented or if it's even possible to be implemented. So we say that whilst that is an excellent initiative, it needs to be complemented by education. Like it needs to be a part of the education that our children receive at school, needs to be about how to filter online fact from fiction, how to work out from the flood of information that you are receiving on a daily basis on the internet, how you work out what's real and what is not.
Or even just ask the question.
Or even just start to think critically about information and put it through a critical filter rather than taking it all at face value. So our Newshounds program, features Squizzy the Newshound, and he teaches kids to stop, think and check. It's really very simple, and it just works on the basis that, if you can get kids before they have a smartphone and you can instill in them some really basic ideas around critical thinking and around being sure to check the source of information. If you can instill those lessons in them at a young age, whilst they're still impressionable and whilst they're still likely to listen to the adults in their lives, then you can send them out into the internet with a greater sense that they are not going to be hoodwinked whilst they're out there.
Both of us are watching Adolescence at the moment, as I'm sure many people are.
And it's such a tale for our time.
Such a tale for our time. There'll be big conversations about that. Yeah. I think we should say, and just in the context of the Squiz, Newshounds has been supported by Google, the Google News Initiative, for a little while now. But what we'd really like to ask for is your help in getting the federal government to fully fund this program. The best way we see it achieving what we'd like it to achieve is that it is a government-mandated program for all schools around the country, primary schools around the country. So the ask is, Bryce?
Well, the ask is that you go to the Squiz Kids website, squizkids.com.au, and you follow the link and sign the petition to call on the federal government to take media literacy education seriously and start to institute it and fund it. Especially important for us because, as you say, the Google News Initiative have been really generous in their funding of it to date. It should also be said that Squiz has underwritten the lion's share of the cost of producing this program, and we have done so because we believe really passionately in a media literate generation. I've spent the last 12 months going backwards and forwards to Canberra, meeting with every politician. You can imagine taking them to schools in their electorate so they can see Newshounds in action in the classroom. We have had more meetings with more ministers and their advisors than I could poke a stick at, but the dial is not moving. I just don't think they understand the urgency that parents, that teachers, that the general population out there thinks that this issue deserves. They don't really appreciate it. And the thing is with Newshounds, they've got a ready-made solution right in front of them. I mean, we created this thing 18 months ago, and with very little promotion, zero marketing, it is in 4,300 classrooms around the country. I mean, if that doesn't say to me that there are teachers out there who understand the urgency of this problem, then I don't know what does. And certainly it's the same with parents all over the country. This is a topic that requires the government to lean into.
Bryce, thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome.
Thanks for watching. For more news with the Squiz, make sure to hit subscribe using the button below.
We're your shortcut to being informed.